You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast, the hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from the ChrisVossShow.com. The Chris Voss Show. Welcome to the big show, my family and friends. We certainly appreciate you guys being here. We are, of course, the Chris Voss Show. The family that loves you, but doesn't judge you, at least not as harshly as your mother or mother-in-law. Now, go clean your room. No, I'm just kidding, folks. Anyway, guys, go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, youtube.com/Chris Voss. What else is there? There's the big LinkedIn group, 130,000 people, LinkedIn.com newsletter. That's very popular over there. You can go check that out. There's one for myself and for the Chris Voss Show. And so that should be pretty cool. We have an amazing historical author on the show. This is his first book that he's put out, and it's going to educate us on a lot of different things. I love history. The one thing man can learn from his history, as I always say, is I set that up with a little bit of sidewind there. The one thing man can learn from his history is that man never learns from his history, and thereby we just go round and round and make all the same mistakes. So the great historians, journalists, and authors that come on the show, they help educate us so that we learn stuff so that we'll be smarter, brillianter, and more sexy in the eyes of others, but also to learn stuff so we don't make the same mistakes again, and maybe we can create a better future. So that's important. We have Nick Tabor on the show, and Nick Tabor is on the show with us today. He is the author of Africatown, America's Last Slave Ship and the Community It Created. Welcome to the show, Nick. How are you?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
There you go. And Nick, you're a freelance journalist whose work has appeared in New York Magazine, the New Republic, the Washington Post, and the Paris Review, and elsewhere. You live in New York, and it's your first book. Welcome to the show. Congratulations on the new book. Give us a .com where people can find you on the interwebs.
Yeah, it's just my name, nicktabor.com.
There you go. Nick, what motivated you want to write this book?
Well, this book originated when I was on staff at New York Magazine in 2018. There was this book coming out called Barracoon, written by Zora Neale Hurston. She wrote it in the 1920s, but it wasn't published for 90 years. And it consists of her interviews with Cudjoe Lewis, who was one of the last survivors still living from the last slave ship that ever came to the U.S.
Wow.
She interviewed him when he was in his 80s. And so it's this amazing historical document that just kind of sat in the vault for decades. So when it was being published, my editor called me in and said, "Hey, we're going to be publishing an excerpt of this book in the magazine. It'd be really great if we could also have a story about what became of the descendants of this guy, Cudjoe Lewis." Mm-hmm. And so she said, "See if you can find him." It might not be easy, but I think you can do it. So it took a couple of weeks to track them down. They had not really made themselves known. But eventually I did reach one of them, a guy named Gary Lumbers, who was living in Philadelphia. And the first time I got Gary on the phone, I remember I was at this hotel room in West Texas working on another story. And he said pretty forcefully, "You don't need to be writing about the descendants. You need to be writing about the neighborhood."
Wow.
Because the survivors of the slave ship created a community after the Civil War, after they were freed, called Africatown. The name has now been shortened to one word, Africatown.
Okay.
When he was growing, it's still around. When he was growing up there, he said it was this thriving community. There were lots of jobs. There were lots of big families. It was like an idyllic experience for him as a child. He said, now if you go there, it looks like a war zone. They built a highway that through the center of the community that wiped out the main business district.
Wow.
He said that the whole area is surrounded by heavy industry. There's so much pollution. People think there's a cancer epidemic. And so it was obviously, and the population was like a fraction of what it had been when he was a kid. So he was saying this is not just like another story of like deindustrialization, like Flint or something, where a factory leaves. It was like this neighborhood was actively destroyed. And he wanted to know how that happened. He said, that's what you should be writing about. And I ended up visiting, and I happened to be there on a day when this law firm was interviewing people about cancer cases. They were getting ready to sue one of the paper mills that had long been in Africatown, getting ready to sue them for all the pollution on the basis that they had caused all these cancer cases. So I interviewed a whole bunch of people at this church who each could just rattle off a list of people from their families who had died from cancer, often at young ages, and a lot of people who had survived it themselves. And the pastor told me that it had been that way ever since he came to the neighborhood. It really seemed like more than just your standard amount of cancer in a community. So it left a stark impression on me. I kept thinking, what is the link between the slave ship and the pollution? Like, how did this neighborhood get sort of singled out to bear so much of the industrial pollution of Southern Alabama? Like, of all the places they could have put those factories, why did they choose the neighborhood that was established by the survivors of the last slave ship?
Wow.
And so I wanted to piece it together. So I kept thinking, I wish I could just move down there and devote myself to that full time and really piece together all of those links decade by decade. And then it occurred to me one day on my walk home from the subway that I probably could do that, that a publisher would be interested. And so at the end of 2019, with a book contract in hand, I moved down to Alabama to investigate that question.
Wow. There you go. Now, moving down there, I mean, are you a little concerned? Do you move to Africatown specifically? And, I mean, with the pollution and cancer rates and stuff, or do you move someplace close by?
I moved to a place close by.
Okay.
There's not a lot of rental property, within Africatown anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite an intimate community, and it would have, it wouldn't have felt appropriate for me to move right into the center of it. But I was there often. I was really a pretty short bike ride away, living within Mobile. And for the first few months before the COVID lockdowns began, I was there just about every day. Anytime there was a meeting in the community or some kind of event, I was there. If there was a cleanup day, I was there with a rake or a shovel, like not just reporting, but volunteering. So I immersed myself in the place as much as I could.
There you go. And so the book is a story that's not only about the original, this slave ship, the last slave ship. It's about this community, and then also what's kind of billed as environmental racism.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the story of the slave ship itself is pretty riveting, I should say. It's worth giving some background on that, I think. The voyage began in the spring of 1860. Mobile was one of the largest port cities in the United States. It was third, in fact, right after New York and New Orleans. Like, so much cotton being moved in and out of Africatown, or of Mobile. And so there was this shortage of enslaved people, of enslaved workers. It was not legal to import them from West Africa anymore. They had long since this country had long since banned the transatlantic slave trade. Mm-hmm. But this business magnate named Timothy Mayer, who owned a lumber mill and a shipyard and some other businesses, the lore is that he told his friends, he said, well, the federal government says they're going to crack down on these illegal voyages, but I don't believe it. And I'll put my money where my mouth is, and I will send a ship to West Africa and bring over, 100 slaves. And I'm going to prove that the federal government isn't serious, and that, you know, you can still get away with this. And it seems as if he meant this as an act of political protest.
Wow.
He was like, he and quite a few other Southern businessmen were pushing to have the slave trade reopened. And so this was, it seems like this was part of that campaign. He was, as I say, he was kind of putting his money where his mouth was. So he sent this ship over. It arrived in the port of Ouidah in the Gulf of Guinea that spring. Carried over about 110 men, women, and children across the Middle Passage. The journey took about 6 or 7 weeks and was, you know, just a truly horrific experience for the people on board. The ship sneaked into Mobile Bay. The captain transferred all the people to another ship, and hid them in like a swamp for weeks, and burned the ship down to the waterline to destroy the evidence.
Wow.
To make sure that it would be impossible to prosecute them. And everybody in Mobile knew about this. It was reported in the newspaper immediately, and then went global. I found dozens, like scores of newspapers where it was reported that week, mostly in the US, but also in Europe. And I've always suspected that the guy who was behind it all actually tipped the newspaper off. We don't know, but that's sort of my guess.
Wow.
Educated guess. So he got away with it. The prosecutors, you know, the local federal prosecutor knew about it, but didn't prosecute anyone. The Civil War started 9 months after the voyage, and after that, nobody wanted to prosecute. You know, nobody in the South was going to prosecute someone for bringing slaves over. So 5 years later, these people were emancipated, and they had no way of getting back to West Africa. They wanted to go back home, but they couldn't. So they created this. So a few dozen of them out of more than 100 created this community where they could speak Yoruba and other West African languages, and choose their own leaders, and sort of be left alone and govern themselves. They bought property, they built houses, and this place became known as Africatown. There's really nothing else like it in the United States. A community that was created by people who had been brought through the Middle Passage by West Africans who had themselves survived the Middle Passage. So because it's such a dramatic history, I thought this was the perfect story to talk about environmental racism. So this is a widespread problem. It's a common thing for communities of color to be like heavily overburdened with pollution, or in some cases, just to have really bad infrastructure, to be underdeveloped. You know, there are cases in states like Alabama where communities of color just don't have like functioning sewers and plumbing. But more often it takes the form of like factory pollution, or here in New York where I am, we have this section in the Bronx that we call Asthma Alley. The Cross Bronx Expressway, this big highway runs through it, and there's so much exhaust from the cars that kids who grow up there very often suffer from asthma. And in so many of these cases, the racial composition of the neighborhood is directly linked to the development patterns and the ways that factories got sited there or highways got built there. And so the point of this book was to figure out how it happened in this one community, but also like through that lens to get a better sense of how it happens everywhere, and why places like the South Bronx exist too. I really could say that by extension, it's a way of trying to understand better, you know, how race still, how it still plays a role in the way our cities are shaped, and distribution of power, and who controls what resources.
Yeah. We had Eddie Glad Jr. on the show, and we talked about how, communities were built, freeways were built. We were built to separate separate us from each other, white and black communities, and sadly create blighted areas that didn't have a lot of jobs and other opportunities, and it kind of you end up with different issues, and I'm sure pollution is another factor. But this is a pretty unique story. And he'd written a book on Baldwin, James
Yeah,
Baldwin.
Begin Again. Yeah,
Yeah, Begin Again. And the interesting thing about James Baldwin is you can take and lift all of his quotes and all of his writings from the 60s and 50s and literally just transpose them to today, and they still work, sadly. So this is really interesting, and it's extraordinary. It's the last slave ship because it had been outlawed. They came in, they cover it up. These folks build a community because they miss their homeland and they want to speak their language. And then, so what happens after this? Does basically robber barons or people of industry, white people of industry, take advantage of them by coming in with pollution generating things, and then you've got Jim Crow laws that come in and different things like that. How does it evolve from there to where now it's become incredibly polluted and they have cancer issues? Kind of like
yeah,
it kind of almost seems like who's that one gal? Brockovich, Aaron Brockovich
yeah,
movie
Brockovich.
sort of thing. Yeah.
It is quite similar. Yeah, I was able to find answers in the course of my couple years of research. I always think that you have to go back to Reconstruction right after the Civil War to understand the broader story. So right after the war, it was unclear what the North, what the federal government was going to do for the black people in the South who had just been set free. And one of my favorite Americans is Thaddeus Stevens, who was one of the radical Republican legislators who he gave a speech in 1865, right after the war in Pennsylvania, where he said, if we're really serious about reforming this country and reforming the South, what we need to do is seize the plantations, like take the land from those Southern aristocrats, break those plantations up and give the land to the black people. And he said, we'll accomplish two things that way. We'll create this broad class of black entrepreneurs, yeoman farmers. At the same time, we'll also break up the planter class and shatter their power and their hold on Southern politics and the economy for good. It obviously did not happen. Like the Confederates, the Confederate traders did not have their land taken away from them, and so part of the reason I bring it up is that people like Timothy Mayer, the guy who chartered this slave voyage, would have been exactly the kind of person who would have been targeted by a policy like that. He owned all of this land and had all of this wealth, and if a proposal like Thaddeus Stevens' idea had gone through, then that wealth, that land and that wealth would have been redistributed to, probably did some of the people that he brought over on the Clotilda. Instead, he held on to it. He passed it on to his kids. Around the turn of the century, all these Jim Crow laws were passed. And it's not just, I think it's important to understand that the Jim Crow laws were not just segregation laws. They were also, like all of the Southern governments, starting with Mississippi, created new laws, or in some cases rewrote their constitutions to systematically strip black people of their voting rights.
Wow.
So they just had no political power anymore. They had no way of standing up for their rights. Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of a deadly combination of for them it turned out to be deadly. No wealth, no land, forced to continue working for pitiful wages for the people who used to keep them enslaved. At the same time, Northern industry started making incursions on the South. It was like the first version of offshoring jobs to other countries. They these northern companies founded in the South, there were no unions, and the Southern governments were so happy to have them, they would just let them do anything. Let them tear apart the forests, let them pollute the rivers, and let them treat the workers poorly. And so the people who benefited from that were the wealthy people in the South, like the Mayer family, who already had this land.
Mm-hmm.
We see how this plays out in Africatown in the 1920s. The largest paper company in New England approached the Chamber of Commerce in Mobile and said, "We want to build a paper factory somewhere in your county. Can you hook us up?" And it looks as if the way this happened is the Chamber of Commerce said, "Yeah, you should, let us introduce you to the Mayer family, the son of the guy who brought the slaves over.
Wow.
Like, he has lots of land that nobody's using." And so the company ended up, I think, originally leasing and maybe later buying, some property from the Mayer family. Built this enormous paper factory at the border of Africatown. People didn't know as much about environmental health back then, but they knew that paper factories smelled terrible.
Wow.
And of course they didn't want it downtown. But the people living in Africatown didn't have any say over whether they wanted it in their backyard or not. And so after that one was built, the area became increasingly industrialized, and more and more factories were added on, and a lot of that land actually was built on, a lot of those factories were built on land that belonged to the family of the guy who brought the people over.
Wow. It's just extraordinary. You have multi-generational environmental racism, basically. They go handed down through generations, and land and ownership and stuff. I was reading here from equaljusticeinitiative.org. Paper, asphalt, petrochemical plants, pipelines, and coal terminals surrounded the town. This was from an article from 2018, and they talked about how activists successfully defeated an oil storage tank farm proposal in 2015, but last year, this would have been 2017, Mobile, Alabama, adopted a future land use plan that leaves Africatown's small residential area unprotected from the continued threat of further industrialization. So, even as recently as a few years ago, this sort of issue is going on. I was also reading The Guardian that from that same time in 2018, Senator Cory Booker and EPA environmental justice lead was looking into it. Has anything come of this? Have they still lost their rights? Has there been anything that the attorneys are helping achieve, or any politicians or politics or the EPA?
There have been some developments. First I should say that the wreckage of the ship itself, the Clotilda, was identified in the Mobile Delta in 2000. It was 2019 when they announced it. It took like a year's worth of research before they felt confident that the ship that they had singled out was the right one. And that was an extraordinary piece of news. I mean, it's very few slave wrecks have ever been found off of the American coastlines, and this one is probably the most intact of any slave ship we've ever identified.
Wow.
So that's a big deal. The people in Africatown are trying to, they feel like their best hope for protecting the community and restoring the housing and bringing some jobs. They think their best hope is to make it sort of a heritage tourism destination.
Yeah.
You mentioned EJI, Equal Justice Initiative. They have this lynching memorial in Montgomery.
Oh yeah.
And it's a pretty unsettling experience to go to that memorial and the museum that's connected. But it's a profound experience, I have to say. It's something you never forget. And within a year of it opening, it had brought it had brought thousands, I think maybe hundreds of thousands of visitors from all over the world, and had generated something like $1 billion in economic activity for the city of Montgomery. And so we feel like people in the community feel like there is an appetite for that kind of experience that helps you, I guess, sort of encourages you to reflect on some of the most horrific episodes from American history. Of course, it's also, in this case, it's also a story of heroism, I think, and endurance. At any rate, that's what they have in mind. The discovery of the ship is a big asset in that endeavor. The other thing that's happened is there was a documentary that aired on Netflix. It's still on, but it debuted in the fall. It was backed by the Obama's production company. Some of your viewers and listeners might have seen it. It's called Descendant.
Oh,
and it's a marvelous documentary. It I think a brilliant piece of filmmaking. I was involved in making it, but I'm not taking any credit here. It's because of other. My role was pretty small, and it's because of the work of many others on the team, especially the director Margaret Brown, that it was so good. That has brought a huge amount of attention to this neighborhood, and on the strength of that documentary, a coalition from Africatown recently visited the White House and spoke with members of the Biden administration. There's quite a lot more money coming in to the community now. There is so there's a lot of support from outside. The city of Mobile, it's my perception is that the city of Mobile can't decide whether it wants to be more like Charleston, South Carolina, and emphasize its what could be a beautiful waterfront. Unfortunately, the waterfront is all occupied by heavy industry, and you can't really get to the water in Mobile. But that's one version of Mobile that we could have. It still has some beautiful architecture downtown. It has great seafood. Whether they want to make it a tourist destination like that, or whether they want to stake everything on the petroleum industry like Houston, and you can't have both. Those are two very different kinds of cities. And but they like to think that they can have both. So they tend to give lip service to these efforts to make Africatown a heritage tourism destination, but in practice, they're not really giving a lot of meaningful support. There is, however, a museum opening in July there. That'll be the first piece of real infrastructure that the community has for receiving visitors. And so we're all looking forward to that. It'll be a good development.
Awesome sauce. What do you feel? What do you hope people come away with reading the book and learning about this important piece of history that shaped us?
I've sometimes thought that. So I guess it depends on who the reader is. I sometimes thought when I was working on this that I thought about what I was like when I was a teenager. This, a pretty conservative teenager, actually, growing up in the Midwest, and I felt like maybe there was a time when affirmative action made sense, but at that point it certainly did not. I thought it was just whatever, reverse racism. I just didn't really believe. I felt like the African Americans I knew were pretty much treated fairly by teachers, by our bosses at work, and I felt like racism just wasn't really a serious force in America anymore. And when I was working on this book, I felt like, that's obviously not my perspective now. There were times when I was working on this book when I felt like I want to write a book that would have persuaded me when I was a teenager that race still was really a powerful factor in shaping people's lives in America. Now, maybe a lot of your readers don't need to be persuaded of that. Maybe they already know. But I also think that I think this book makes it clear and explicit in a way that not many stories really could, because the links are so direct and so strong in this case. I also think that there's just not nearly enough awareness of environmental racism, and there's not enough literature about it. And as I say, because this story is so dramatic, because it's this riveting story about the last slave ship and the survivors, in a way I felt like I was baiting the hook, like I could get people to read about environmental racism in this case because it's such a rich, dramatic narrative. So I think people should read it because I think they'll find it gripping. The story itself is just a gripping one, but I think that it also fills a void of literature on environmental racism, and I hope readers will read it and learn more about that.
Definitely. And we can't change the future unless we understand the past, the mistakes we made. We can't correct them and what goes on. And then it's sad, a lot of the stuff that's happened in the course of our history, but we need to look at it and go, hey man, we can do better. We should do better. We hope we want to do better.
There's one other thought I've had about solutions, about like what does this mean? How does this cash out in terms of how we can change the future, or change the present? How can we change? What does this tell us about how we can affect change in the world? And you mentioned those tank farms in Africatown. There was a proposal to build all these petroleum tanks that are like, each one is like the size of a house. They're huge. Wow. There are already some tank farms like that near the neighborhood. But at the same time, there was a proposal to build a pipeline through the main water supply for southern Alabama, not just Africatown, but everybody. And lots of white people showed up when they heard about the pipeline going through the water supply. People believed that the tank farm in Africatown and the pipeline through the lake were connected. And so for the first time, all these white people felt like they started to sort of link arms with people in Africatown because they felt like they had a shared interest here. They felt like each of them had something at stake. Like Africatown didn't want the tank farms and nobody wanted their water supply to be endangered. And one of the central people in the book told me, Mobile was a pretty segregated city, politically especially. He said that when these protesters went down to City Hall, Black people and white people together, linking arms, to say we don't want this, that it was obvious that people in the city council were surprised. They'd never seen that before. They'd never seen that kind of thing in Mobile. He said you could see it in their eyes. And so, and ultimately they were successful in blocking those tank farms from being built. And I think the takeaway is that what you have to do is try to create an interracial coalition that's not just based on white people's pangs of conscience, not just based on them wanting to do the right thing, but to really obtain a majority, to get the kind of critical mass you need in a majoritarian democracy. It has to be based on people's shared material interests. That's what drives, a lot of the time anyway, sometimes it's culture wars, but a lot of the time that's what drives people to the polls. It's things like healthcare. It's things like schools. It's their paychecks and their health and the health of their children. So I think that that's something we can learn from this story.
There you go. I love what you said there. It's a great little vignette. The common good of everyone. Unfortunately, we live in a world where politics is used against us by politicians. And of course, we chose them, so you get the politicians you vote for. But we live in this world of scarcity, where we're told, if we help somebody else, it takes away from us. And really, when you study America in its early years, the rising tide lifts all boats. That's the beauty of America. It's the melting pot of the ideas and people and cultures and races and people from all walks of life that have made America great and have contributed in so many different ways. And so we need to, books like this help us understand that the rising tide lifts all boats. We need to help everybody, because when everybody wins, we all win. And when we live in this scarcity mindset, we're just sitting and fighting, clawing over scraps, and meanwhile, billionaires are wandering off laughing or something. You're just
right.
like,
Yeah, that's the thing. I think you have to identify the actual malefactors, whether it was, the railroad companies in the 1800s, or, or the oil companies and maybe the tech companies and the banks today. Like it's not the people who have no power, like, undocumented immigrants who are making your life worse. It's the people who control all the resources.
So yeah, it's very interesting. Well, wonderful to have you on the show. Give us your .com so people can have you on the check you out on the interweb and get to know you better.
For sure. It's nicktabor.com, TABOR.
There you go. Thanks, Nick, for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks to my audience for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, youtube.com/Chris Voss, and all the other crazy places we are in the interwebs, the LinkedIn, etc. Thanks for tuning in. Be good to each other. Stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.